Emmett had a career that was unbelievable.
Once he set a goal, I don't think he ever took his eye off that.
He constantly tried to improve himself, working his way up until finally he hit the top.
Well, I've known Emmett Smith for roughly 75 years because he lived out on Warren Street, right across from Stewart's. And we lived over on Maple Street, right across from the freight station. And that's probably when I first, started bumping heads with Emmett. And then probably in the late 30s, early 40s, Emmett and his mother and his two brothers, Bobby and Raymond, moved up to Cherry Street. And we moved up on Dix Avenue. So, we still were close friends, and we had quite a gang there. And, the gangs then were not anything like the gangs today. None of us ever got arrested, and we never got in any real trouble.
Glens Falls was a lot of fun, although sometimes we used to say, when we graduate from St. Mary's, we're probably going to go somewhere else because there might be a little bit more to do. But in looking back, there was a lot to do. I mean, the Godnick building was the YMCA. We played a little basketball there.
I used to play softball on the road. Sagamore Playground was a very busy place. We used to go to Having Cove, swimming. They took the train to Lake George. Movies, hanging out.
There was a ton of activity. They had dances every weekend. So we used to travel across that bridge to South Glens Falls and Hudson Falls and up at the high school.
After school, we used to play pitch cards. And you go to the store, and for a penny, you got a little packet. There was 3 strips of bubble gum and a picture card. It could be a cowboy, an Indian, ball player. And I used to meet him after school. And shortly after, he moved next door to us on Cherry Street, one of the Nellie Morse's upscale apartments. And across the street lived his future wife, Teresa.
He brought me along a lot when he did things with his friends, whether they were going to Lake George or going to ball games. I know there was one year while he was playing ball that I went to every football game, which meant taking a bus a few times, and those guys were also at the house a lot. So I knew him awfully well, and when I got out of high school, if they were still around, I mean, they would know you and come over and talk to you, and they were nice people. He had, the guys he spent time with in high school were really nice people that had nice careers, and some of them stayed in Glens Falls.
You go back then, and Emmett, and I've talked about this, and he remembers it well, like the Warren Pharmacy was quite a hangout, but they had a beat cop there, Nick Lynch. And he'd come along, if you were a little bit rowdy, he had that billy club. And he'd just jab you in the chest and, man, you move. When he pulled that out, you moved.
I remember Ray and I were not the students that Emmett was at St. Mary's. And I remember it seemed like weekly, my mother was going to the convent to find out what Ray or I had done wrong that day. And she said to me one night, she said, if I wanted to spend that much time in the convent, I'd have become a nun.
We grew up in the best of times. We didn't have any junk, but we all raised hell. If you stepped out of line, those nuns didn't bat an eyelash at whacking you over the hands with the ruler. It didn't hurt,
We always used to look at St. Mary's as a big school, and we always admired particularly their athletic abilities. And they seemed to have a closeness and a togetherness that some of the schools didn't have.
He played basketball for St. Mary's, and he played football for St. Mary's. Danny Reardon was the coach. I used to go to the games and watch him play.
At that time, we didn't have a television set, so our entertainment was high school sports and St. Mary's sports, and Emmett was very involved in all of that. And he also spent an awful lot of time with me and my classmates, and he coached us in football. We had a basketball team, and we played at the Y and at St. Mary's, and we went out of town a few times to play different teams, and he was the coach of all of that.
No, Emmett and I worked for probably one of our first jobs, worked for J.J. Burns, Jacko Burns. And it was right in the Gubitz building, which was across from Old Lady Falls, okay? But Emmett and I used to be over there every Sunday morning folding papers, you know.
Unfortunately, he went to a Jesuit school in New York called Fordham, which Holy Cross didn't look too well on. We used to play him in football a lot. We said it was a fairly good school, but from Fordham then, I guess he went out and went to law school.
I remember him at Fordham. I think we stayed once in one of the dorms in Fordham, and then he got married pretty early in college. And then I remember him and Therese had a apartment in the Bronx.
I was looking for a job in New York, and I went down to the Bronx with Emmett one week, and I stayed at him for 2 or 3 days. And then later on, mid-60s, I was working at 300 Park Avenue, and Emmett was working with Union Carbide about 3 blocks down the street, and we used to hook up for lunch once in a while.
And he could have gone to work locally for the General Electric Company, but at the time, Emmett thought he was worth more than the $50 or $60 a week they were willing to pay. So he looked around and he got a job with Haloid in Rochester, which later changed its name to Xerox. There was a fellow that worked for Xerox, I believe his name was Paul Thayer, and he at one point worked for one of the presidents of the United States. Paul Thayer called Emmett, and I believe he offered him the chief corporate counsel's job of LTV, which was a big company.
He's one of the smartest guys that I've ever met, and even though he was never in the banking business, he understands banking and he understands law, and he's just got a lot of good common sense. The other thing, it's obvious, he's a family man. He loves his family, and he talks about his family, and not in a bragging manner, but there's just family love there.
He certainly was right there to help his brothers anytime they needed help, and I mean, keeping them on the straight and narrow to help the mother. You know, the mother was a great woman, but I'm sure he was responsible for Raymond and Bobby, because they turned out to be very good products too, you know.
Well, to me, he's been very generous. He's helped me in a lot of ways, and I think we have a good relationship, very strong relationship.
I was helping Glens Falls Hospital try to raise some money, and sure enough, Emmett's name was on my list, and I volunteered to call on him even though I had not met him, and I did, and paid him a visit and got a nice pledge from him. I was very pleased, and then I find out about 2 weeks later that he didn't just pledge that amount that he told me, but he did 5 times the amount that he was going to do. So after that, I called him up and I said, Emmett, that's extremely generous. I've never had that happen in my career trying to raise money. And I said, I'll buy you lunch, how's that? I'll try to get even. So a few weeks later, we had lunch, and I got to know Emmett, and I was impressed by him, actually. Not only his generosity, but his intelligence and the career that he had had. And one thing led to another, and we became a lunch group on Fridays.
So we have lunch every Friday, and we don't solve any of the problems of the world, but we discuss them heavily and have a good time, you know.
I just have a good time every week when we get together. And sometimes we'll, one of his friends that did graduate close by, Dick, we get together for lunch too. Take turns.
Well, we go to the Montcalm, we go to the Dock Cider, we go to Olive Garden, you know. Got to go somewhere where you can have a little drink.
Emmett is a fine man. He's a gentleman. He's on the reserve side. He's conservative. He's humble. He stayed true to his roots.
Highly ethical, very serious, focused, extremely hardworking, strong willpower. He has, you know, it's almost like listing, if you're taking a test in school and they say, well, put down 10 or 20 traits that are positives. Well, I don't have to take the test. Someone said, what are Emmett's strengths? And those strengths are the same, they parallel.
Once he set a goal, I don't think he ever took his eye off that. And there's a lot of things that can interfere with your direction. It never interfered with him.
This man has met personally 3 presidents, and so I mean to go from St. Mary's and Glens Falls to that height deserves a lot of credit.
Certainly Emmett, you know, could be proud of himself. He's been a credit to his family, to St. Mary's, and to his job, and particularly to himself. He's been very successful. He doesn't flaunt it, you know, and we're fortunate to have him as a citizen and contributor to St. Mary's Academy.